Right. So we're almost ready. Got it. Screen is high enough for you, and then
Yeah, it should be fine.
I'm just going to make sure this going to be muted. You don't want to hear it 3 times. Oh. So we're getting there. All right. So we're delighted to have back with us. She's almost our in-house historian at this point, Dr. Karen Sonnelitter. She's Associate Professor of History at Siena College here in Loudonville, and she completed her doctorate at Purdue University. This lecture is part of our The Irish and series, and this month you might have noticed the theme is the Irish and the English. So Karen has just recently published a book of primary source documents, which she's kind of annotated. But of course, the relationship with Ireland's closest neighbour has been sort of the most important, you could argue, relationship for the country, particularly over the last 800 years. So Karen will talk us through some of the high points and lowlights. Those of you who may have been on, was it last night we did the night before, I think we had our talk about Brexit. So we've been focusing a lot on Anglo-Irish this week, but we're delighted to have Karen with us. I'm going to let her get back into sharing the screen. And you can take it away. Okay, thanks everyone. Oh, and I should say, if you do have any question, please type it in the Q&A feature here. You can just hover over the screen and it'll pop up. The chat is not abled.
Oh, okay. All right, great.
Good, thanks. Yay.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here virtually, and thank you to those of you who are here today in person. Thank you to Elizabeth Stack and to the museum for organizing tonight's event. So I'm speaking to you today about my most recent book. Sorry, just trying to advance the slides.
You did.
Oh.
Oh, no, I did that. Did you click into it?
Okay, here we are. All right, thanks. Figuring it out. Okay, so I'm speaking today about my most recent book, a collection of primary source documents that detail Irish-English relations. So this is a bit different from normal talks I give because the topic is just really broad. But this collection came together at the request of my publishers, Broadview, for whom I did an earlier volume on the famine. In the wake of the UK's 2016 referendum on membership in the European Union, so Brexit, many people in England and many other parts of the European Union became rather suddenly aware of the complex history between Ireland and England. Now, I realize that's not necessarily true of the audience here tonight, or perhaps many of you, but it's certainly not true of most people in Ireland, either the Republic of Ireland or the North, but many others have had the privilege of ignorance on these issues. And this volume is an attempt to provide resources to correct that ignorance. On December the 22nd, 1919, David Lloyd George, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, rose to address the House of Commons on the topic of Ireland. And by that point, it had been almost a year since 73 Sinn Féin representatives elected to Parliament in 1918 had refused to take their seats in Westminster and declared themselves the Dáil Éireann. Violence had broken out not long after, and in September of 1919, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Viscount French, had declared the Dáil to be illegal. Lloyd George characterized the ongoing conflict as, quote, an old family quarrel, a quarrel which has degenerated many times into a blood feud. He would go on to describe the relationship between Ireland and England as one of mutual misunderstanding and miscommunication by saying there is a path of fatality which pursues the relations between the two countries and makes them eternally at cross purposes. Sometimes Ireland demands too much. Sometimes when Ireland is reasonable, England offers too little. And sometimes when Ireland is friendly, England is sulky. Sometimes when England has been friendly, Ireland has been angry. And sometimes when both Britain and Ireland seem to be approximating towards friendship, some untoward incident sweeps them apart and the quarrel begins again. As Prime Minister, Lloyd George would oversee one of the more consequential periods in the long and often fraught relationship. The Easter Rising broke out months before he became Prime Minister in December of 1916. He became Prime Minister in December of 1916. Obviously, the risings, yeah. His attempts to extend conscription to Ireland in 1918 played a role in Sinn Féin's landslide victory in the election of 1918. The Government of Ireland Act of 1920 partitioned Ireland into North and South. And finally, towards the end of his tenure as Prime Minister, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December of 1921, which created the Irish Free State. It's not surprising, then, that in 1919, Ireland and England would seem eternally at cross purposes. In 2014, during a very different stage in the relationship between Ireland and England, the Irish president, and still Irish president, Michael D. Higgins, said on the occasion of a state visit to England that, quote, "Ireland and Britain live in both the shadow and the shelter of one another, and so it has been since the dawn of history. Through conquest and resistance, we have cast shadows on each other, but we have also gained strength from one another as neighbors, and most especially from the contribution of those who have traveled between our islands in recent decades." Over the years, politicians on both sides of the Irish Sea have used a lot of different metaphors to explain the relationship between Ireland and England. Now, in many ways, the modern relationship between England and Ireland fits neatly into the dynamics that we often see between larger nations and their smaller neighbors. In 2020, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland had a population of 67 million people, 56.5 million of them in England. Had a gross domestic product of 2.8 trillion US dollars. The Republic of Ireland, as of 2021, has a population of 5.01 million people and a gross domestic product of 418 billion US dollars. Northern Ireland does add an additional 1.9 million people to the population of the island of Ireland. So England is vastly larger in terms of population, in terms of economy, and honestly, even in terms of land mass. It's about 18,000 square miles larger than the island of Ireland. So while the size of their respective populations and economies have varied considerably over time, England has pretty much always been the larger geographically, demographically, population-wise, and economically. Now, there are numerous examples of this dynamic around the world. Physically, demographically, or economically larger nations are able to overshadow their smaller neighbors. The smaller nation and its residents are often acutely aware of almost everything that happens within the larger nation, while the larger nation and its residents have the privilege of ignorance about the smaller one. So the local example, of course, would be the US-Canadian relationship. Canada is obviously geographically larger than the United States, but in terms of population, much smaller. Canadians know pretty much everything about American politics, and we generally don't know very much about theirs. For Ireland and England, this dynamic is complicated by a long and tumultuous shared history, either a family quarrel or a path of fatality. That provides extra layers of meaning to even the most seemingly innocuous interaction. This book and this talk tonight is an attempt to provide context to explain those layers of meaning. The documents come from a variety of sources, both English and Irish, to help illuminate a greater understanding of the course of the relationship. Now, it is very easy when discussing this relationship to fall into what historians generally call presentism, to read back into the past to the issues of the present day. So, for example, it's very easy to read present-day nationalism into medieval and early modern Irish rebellions and conflicts, but it is inaccurate to do so. A 12th century Gaelic lord did not have a sense of himself as Irish in the same way many do today, and his conflicts with the Anglo-Norman state have different motivations than the motives that inspired the rebels of the Easter Rising. So if you follow international news, you're of course likely aware that Ireland has been a complicating factor in the UK's decision to leave the European Union. From the Irish perspective, Brexit has complicated a lot of their trade relationships. Most Irish trade with Europe went through England at some point, and England is itself a major Irish trading partner. Now, I should note, by the way, that the movement of people between the UK and the Republic of Ireland is not supposed to be affected by any particular deals because the Common Travel Area was established in 1952, and so it predates EU membership. But the largest issue really has been Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was predicated on both the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom being members of the European Union, and thus allowed for the existence of an open border on the island of Ireland. most negotiations since 2016 have focused on how to maintain that open border. These negotiations and the public discourse surrounding them have revealed the vastly different views that people in Ireland and in England have of their mutual history. Part of these different views stem from different levels of knowledge. In 2020, Leo Varadkar noted that we really understand a lot about Britain, but I think a lot of British people don't understand a lot about Ireland. And politicians in Westminster had to learn more about Ireland. So, for example, the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Karen Bradley, admitted that she was, quote, unaware that nationalists did not vote for unionists and unionists did not vote for nationalists. Not doing any favors for Karens worldwide, unfortunately. In 2018, the future Home Secretary Priti Patel argued that the threat of food shortages in Ireland should be used to negotiate a better deal for Britain. And if she had read my previous book, she might have known to phrase that a little bit differently. Irish people who live in England talk about these kinds of things a lot, being on the receiving ends of potato jokes. Jennifer Horgan, for instance, wrote about a colleague teasing her, "Why the salad, Jen? I thought you Irish loved a potato." The writer Megan Nolan tells a similar story in a 2018 op-ed. Both writers make clear the problem is the context. Who was delivering the joke made it something annoying rather than funny. Nolan's piece in particular unpacks the importance of context particularly well. She discussed what was at the time in 2018 a viral video of an English tourist throwing a pigeon head at housing protesters in Dublin and said, quote, "But stranger still, or perhaps upon reflection, not strange at all, was the gap between the English and the Irish when it came to interpreting the pigeon incident. While Irish people complained about these brash, bird head wielding English tourists coming to our country and performing their odd little colonial pantomime, sensitive Britons were eager to ask why it mattered that the men were English. They're just louts, they said. Why does it matter where they're from? After all, that occupation business was so long ago." Horgan went on to note that while British people are taught not to know, not to care about Ireland's history, Irish people carry it around with us. Every political gaffe, every time an Irish celebrity is wrongly claimed as British, every mix-up of Britain, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, every time it happens, is corrected, and happens again, sets the relationship back. It makes Irish people feel as if their nationality, their distinct cultural differences, is a detail too insignificant to learn about. Yes, it's time we move on, but to do so requires respect and knowledge on both sides. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to include either of those two pieces in the collection, both because of copyright, but also because I ended this collection before 2015. Anything I could write about Brexit negotiations would be outdated by the time the book came out. And as it turns out, it was, because this book came out in December and the new Windsor framework came out in February. So I was right. But there are other sources that speak to this issue about context and why that matters so much in explaining the relationship. So, for example, this one, which we'll see if we can play just the beginning of it for you. It's Queen Elizabeth II's speech from her 2011 state visit to Ireland.
Agus a coisa.
Now, I don't know about you, but I have never received a rapturous round of applause for saying 4 words in Irish. I've tried, and it's just really never gotten that response from me, right? All she says, by the way, is president and friends, right? But of course I haven't, right? And she does. Because what makes the words important is who said them, right? No one cares that I can say a couple words in Irish. They care a lot if the Queen of England does, right? For a regnant English monarch to speak in Irish was seen as a show of respect that people found moving and that was politically meaningful, even if it's only a few words, right? Now, the knowledge gap is complicated. As a historian, I can't teach my Irish history class without talking about England a lot. And when I teach English history classes, I could honestly leave out Ireland entirely. I don't. But the integrative approach to English history, where you talk about Wales and Scotland and Ireland, that's actually a fairly new one. History, even when it's understudied, shapes English-Irish relations in a variety of ways. And one of the themes of the collection is the creation over time of English views of Ireland and the Irish, and how those views can shape and direct policy. Oh. Okay. There we go. All right. The paths of English and Irish history diverged centuries before the arrival of the first Norman knights in 1169. Beginning in 43 CE, the Roman Empire invaded and settled within most of what is now England. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, the island of Britain was invaded once again in the 5th century by Germanic tribes. The Celtic and Roman Britons gradually merged with these Germanic settlers, although Celtic languages survived within pockets of what is now in England. Ireland, meanwhile, was separate from these events. It was not a part of the Roman world. It was not conquered by Rome, at least, although it traded with Rome. But Romans never bothered to conquer Ireland. They termed it Hibernia, which implies they thought it was cold, which makes sense, I guess, if you're from Rome, but not if you're from upstate New York. Celtic groups began arriving in Ireland around 700 BCE and remained dominant until the Normans. Irish tribes traded with the Roman Empire and the rest of Europe, and they also sent raiding parties to the island of Britain to capture slaves. Most famously, the patron saint of Ireland, St. Patrick, was such a captive. Patrick was born the son of a Roman official from near the Scottish border. And in his Confessio, Patrick recounts spending 6 years as a shepherd in Western Ireland before escaping. Once he returned home, he received visions that told him to return to Ireland and convert the people there, which he did. Now, in reality, of course, Patrick is not the only Christian missionary sent to Ireland. He's just the most iconic. In the centuries that followed St. Patrick, Irish Christianity developed along a decentralized model that favored the power of abbots and monasteries more so than bishops, which makes sense. Ireland doesn't really have cities. At least it didn't at this point in its history. And so it could not organize a church around urban areas. The Germanic arrival in England delayed the widespread adoption of Christianity there, but in 597, St. Augustine arrived to establish a mission in Canterbury. In England, Augustine established a church that ran along continental models, which centered the power of bishops and a diocese centered in cities. Irish monks, particularly those based out of the monastery of Iona, were very influential in spreading Christianity in northern England, but in southern England, they adopted along the continental model. The differences between these traditions was solidified and symbolically settled at the Synod of Whitby in 664, when the King of Northumbria determined to calculate the date of Easter according to Roman models and not Irish ones. Now, despite these religious differences, early medieval England and Ireland actually have a lot of similarities. Both consist of a number of separate kingdoms constantly fighting each other for land, for wealth, for power. Both have similar experiences of the Viking era. Beginning with the attack at the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793, both dealt with a consistent pattern of Viking raids, which evolved into permanent settlements, and Viking kingdoms became important players in the politics of both countries. The Norman invasion of England marks another significant point of departure between England and Ireland. The exact origins of the Norman invasion are up for debate. The immediate cause, of course, is Dermot MacMurchurra, the King of Leinster, fleeing Ireland and seeking assistance from King Henry II in 1165. But it is likely a possible invasion of Ireland had been broached with Henry II years before that. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Bec, claimed a jurisdiction over the Irish Church, but the Archbishop of Armagh had a competing claim. In 1155, during a royal council at Winchester, Henry II is said to have enthusiastically discussed invading Ireland and made plans to give it to his younger brother, William. But the plan was apparently abandoned due to the disapproval of Henry's mother, the Empress Matilda, who did not think Ireland worth invading. Meanwhile, 1155 is also widely accepted as the year that Pope Adrian IV issued the papal bull, the Loudonville, which commissioned Henry II to intervene in Ireland to reform the Irish Church. Despite this, Henry made no plans to actually intervene in Ireland. So when MacMurchara sought assistance in 1165, Henry II declined to directly intervene. At that point, he was in the midst of his long quarrel with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, which ended in Becket's murder by Henry's knights in 1170. The king did allow MacMurchara to recruit military assistance from some of his vassals, which he promptly did. He was able to recruit most famously Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare. That's Viking raids. And here we go. Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, most commonly known as Strongbow. Strongbow granted assistance in exchange for the promise of a marriage with MacMurchara's daughter Aoife, and the promise that he would succeed him as King of Leinster. Other Norman Welsh families also joined the campaign in exchange for promises of land. All seem to have been from families that were at the time out of favor with Henry II, and so didn't have much hope for advancement otherwise. The Normans arrived in 1169, and they met with quick success. They captured the cities of Wexford, Waterford, and Dublin. In August of 1170, the promised marriage took place between Strongbow and Aoife MacMurchara. This painting is from 1854. An Irish artist, Daniel MacLeish, although you could probably tell that by how he depicts this marriage, not quite the happy occasion, right? The next year, when Dermot MacMurchara died, Strongbow became King of Leinster. Henry II had been prepared to allow his vassals to claim territory in Ireland, but he was not prepared for them to set themselves up as kings in another country. And so he launched his own expedition to Ireland and landed in 1171 near Waterford with a sizable army. He stayed in Ireland for 6 months, receiving the homage of both Norman nobles, but also a number of Irish kings, although notably not Rory O'Connor of Connacht, the most powerful of the Irish kings. In 1175, Henry and O'Connor agreed to what's called the Treaty of Windsor, which was meant to settle their territorial disputes in Ireland, although it didn't actually last very long. In 1185, Henry II's son, Prince John, was sent to Ireland. He seems to have planned to declare him initially king of a separate kingdom, but in the end, John is simply proclaimed Lord of Ireland. Technically, the English don't declare themselves King of Ireland until 1541. Henry VIII does that. Now, Ireland at the time of the Norman invasion consists of all these different separate kingdoms, all of varying size and all pretty much constantly at war with each other. This disunity benefited the Normans, and many Irish kings found it beneficial to fight alongside the English because of long-standing local conflicts. The arrival and settlement of English and Welsh settlers in large portions of Ireland set into motion a number of patterns that repeat over the centuries. In 1183, and 1185, a man named Gerald of Wales, or Geraldus Cambrensis, would travel to Ireland to visit relatives who had settled there, and the second time to accompany Prince John on his travels in the Ireland. The subsequent work that he produced on Ireland, too, most famously the Topographia Hibernica, and then later the Expurgatio Hibernica, play a significant role in the history of Irish-English relations. This medieval colonization establishes a few trends: the claim of the English crown over Ireland, religious disputes, and then we also can see the significance of Gerald's descriptions of Ireland and the Irish people. The essence of his descriptions of Ireland is a beautiful and fertile land filled with barbarous people who are ignorant of true Christianity. And of course, the goal is to justify conquest of and colonization of Ireland in his own time, and ends up serving to do that for centuries after. The most famous section of the book is called Of the Character, Customs, and Habits of the People, and it includes some of these lines, right? But although they are richly endowed with the gifts of nature, their want of civilization shows in their dress and mental culture, makes them a barbarous people. He broadly takes issue with things like the Irish practice of pastoral rather than tillage agriculture, the fact that most in Ireland didn't live in cities and towns. To him, these things are habits based on laziness and not a reflection of a people adapting to their specific environment. That much of Ireland might not be suited for intense tillage agricultural cultivation does not occur to him at all. He also critiques cultural practices, saying he thinks the Irish are not tenderly nursed from their birth. And he cites things like the practices of midwives and the fact that the Irish don't swaddle their children. In a lot of ways, Gerald reads like a miserable tourist, negatively comparing everything he sees to the way things are done back home. There's a lot in what Gerald describes that may or may not be true, and some things that are almost certainly not true. His own travels around Ireland were likely very limited, confined mostly to the Leinster area. So, for instance, he describes a ritual of kingship in Ireland involving animal sacrifice to go along with the crowning of a new king, and there's very possibly true, right? He describes Irishmen slaying each other. No, by the way, Gerald didn't actually draw. Can you do the next slide? Gerald didn't actually draw these marginal illustrations, but they're based on his descriptions. So hence, whoever did draw it never saw a shamrock, apparently. I don't know what to tell you. He also tells other stories, however, that are almost certainly not true. So, for instance, he describes a bearded woman in Limerick and an oxman in Wicklow. He describes a woman in Connacht in inappropriate embrace with a goat. And he broadly does accuse the Irish of bestiality at a few points in the book. But he does, however, praise the work of Irish monastic scribes and musicians, saying their work is not of men, but of angels. Now, I want to be clear that Gerald is a 12th century writer. His critiques of the Irish are not based on race, although they would certainly influence later writings that are. That's not a category that matters so much to him. He does say positive things about the Irish, describing them as being of perfect vigor, tall and handsome in person, and with agreeable and ruddy countenances, saying whatever natural gifts they possess are excellent. Instead, he blames their barbarism on the fact that habits are formed by mutual intercourse. And as this people inhabit a country so remote from the rest of the world and lying at its furthest extremity. For Gerald, the greatest proof of Irish barbarism is their religion. Now, as you are likely aware, religion is a frequent issue in Anglo-Irish relations, but it's one that begins well before the Protestant Reformation. The medieval Catholic Church was very interested in ensuring ecclesiastical conformity. All members of the church needed to worship and believe the same, and ensuring this was a significant element of church reforms at this point in the Middle Ages. So the differences in Irish religious practices were an issue. The Loudonville had authorized the intervention of the English monarchy to reform the Irish church. That includes things like calculating Easter, church organization, also, frankly, tax collection, and all of these doctrinal differences that dated back centuries. Gerald of Wales, by the way, is a priest with unfulfilled ambitions to be a bishop. But my favorite story from Gerald of Wales is the one about the werewolves. Now, this is a little bit long, so I hope you'll indulge me in this story, okay? It goes like this. About 3 years before the arrival of Earl John in Ireland, it chanced that a priest who was journeying from Ulster towards Meath was benighted in a certain wood on the borders of Meath. While in company with only a young lad, he was watched by a fire which he had kindled under the branches of a spreading tree. Lo, a wolf came up to them and immediately addressed them to this effect. Rest secure, be not afraid. There is no reason you should fear where no fear is. The travelers, being struck with astonishment and alarm, the wolf added some orthodox words referring to God. The priest then implored him and adjured him by Almighty God and faith in the Trinity not to hurt them, but to inform them what creature it was in the shape of a beast uttered human words. The wolf, after giving Catholic replies to all questions, added at last, there are two of us, a man and a woman, natives of Ossory, who through the curse of one Nautilus are compelled every 7 years to put off human form and depart from the dwellings of men. Quitting entirely the human form, we assume that of wolves, and at the end of the 7 years that they chance to survive, 2 other beings are substituted in their places. They return to their country in their former shapes. And now she who is my partner in this visitation lies dangerously sick, not far from hence, and she is at the point of death. I beseech you, inspired by divine charity, to give her the consolations of your priestly office. At this word, the priest followed the wolf, trembling, as he led the way to a tree at no great distance, in the hollow of which he beheld a she-wolf, who under that shape was pouring forth human sighs and groans. On seeing the priest having saluted him with human courtesy, she gave thanks to God, who in this extremity had vouchsafed to visit her with such consolation. These rites, having been duly rather than rightly performed, the he-wolf gave them his company for during the night at their little fire, behaving more like a man than a beast. And at the close of their conversation, the priest inquired of the wolf whether the hostile race which had now landed in the island would continue there for the time to come and be long established in it. To which the wolf replied, "For the sins of our nation and their enormous vices, the anger of the Lord, falling on an evil generation, hath given them into the hands of their enemies. Therefore, as long as this foreign race shall keep the commandments of the Lord and walk in his ways, it will be secure and invincible. But if, as the downward path of illicit pleasure is easy, and nature is prone to follow vicious examples, this people shall chance from living among us to adopt our depraved habits. Doubtless they will provoke the divine vengeance on themselves also." Now, it's often argued that this book is a propaganda tool to support the English conquest of Ireland, and I think you can see why. Because even werewolves support the Norman conquest of Ireland. And they support it, you will note, because the Irish worship incorrectly. And that has brought God's judgment upon them. We can see the influence of those werewolves warning about following vicious examples in later medieval history. Right? Now, by the way, stories like this are why I don't think Gerald actually traveled all that far in Ireland, because I've never met a werewolf in Ireland, not even in Ossory. Gerald produced another book in 1189, the Expugnatio Hibernica, the Conquest of Ireland, which focuses very explicitly on the conquest. And in it, he does take time to respond to critics of his earlier work. And you might be pleased to note we are not the first readers to be suspicious of some of these stories. Apparently, people were suspicious in the 1180s as well. It is clear in his foreword that his contemporaries also took issues with his stories, and he's a little defensive about it. The Expugnatio, on the whole, is less fantastical and much more practical in its account. It's very explicitly and directly focused on justifying the conquest. Although he does at several points in the text take stock of its failures. And even by 1189, a lot of those are clear. He has one of his relatives, Maurice Fitzgerald, give a speech lamenting the lack of military support from England, but also like a lack of identity. He has them say, "Such is our lot, that what the Irish are to the English, we too, being now considered as Irish, are the same. The one Ireland does not hold us in greater detestation than the other." Now, you may have heard the phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves. In Latin, hiberniorus, hibernus ipsis, to describe the Anglo-Norman lords of Ireland in the later Norman and early modern period. It originates from a 17th century Irish historian, John Lynch, and he used it in his book, Cambrensis Eversus. And it's a concept that I'm going to talk about a bit. It is a concept we particularly use when I talk about the statutes of Kilkenny, which I will be getting to, but it seems relevant here as well, because Maurice is not expressing a positive Irish identity. He does not want to be seen in this way, right? And the rest of the speech are instructions about how they should keep waging war and keep fighting against the Irish. Inspiring speeches to bolster exhausted troops, however, were only so effective, which Gerald knows. He sums up his take on the conquest rather neatly when he says, "You will find that no nation was ever conquered which did not bring down punishment on themselves for their sin and wickedness. But although the Irish people did well deserve for their grievous offenses and filthy lives to be brought into trouble by the incursions of strangers, they had not so utterly offended God that it was his will that they should be entirely subjugated. Nor were the deserts of the English such as to entitle them to full sovereignty over, and the peaceable obedience of the people they had partly conquered and reduced to submission. Therefore, perhaps it was the will of God that both nations should be engaged in long mutual conflicts, neither of them having merited or altogether forfeited his favor, so that one did not gain the prize of triumphant success, nor is the other so vanquished as to submit their necks generally to the yoke of servitude." 700 years later, David Lloyd George would talk about a path to fatality. 100 years after that, Michael Higgins would speak about the shadow in the shelter. Now, of course, Gerald is a 12th century churchman, so to him, it's the will of God. that the English and the Irish will be at odds. David Lloyd George is a 20th century politician who proposes settling the conflict by conferring self-government. Higgins is a 21st century statesman promoting mutual cooperation during a state visit. We can trace the influence of Gerald forward, but we can't necessarily trace the others backward. It would be a mistake, as I said, to read these nationalist conflicts back onto these medieval experiences. The extent of Norman rule over Ireland was never total, and it declined over time. In 1361, Edward III sent his third son, Lionel, the Duke of Clarence, to restore order to the colony, and the most significant result of this campaign was the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366. The statutes placed blame for the decline of the lordship in Ireland squarely on the colonists for being insufficiently English. But now, many English of the said land, forsaking the English language, manners, mode of writing, laws, and usages, live and govern themselves according to the manners, fashion, and language of the Irish. In short, they've become more Irish than the Irish themselves. But the Statutes of Kilkenny don't view this as a positive, of course. The statutes essentially attempt to forbid contact between the two communities, forbidding marriage, fosterage, acting as godparents, all these things. In practical terms, the Statutes of Kilkenny don't actually change really anything about the status of Ireland, the strength of the lordship. They're not even really enforced. They can't really be. But they are significant in stating an avowed condemnation of integration or accommodation between the two communities. And that's such an odd thing by the standards of medieval document, particularly the ban on intermarriage and fosterage. These are important tools of medieval diplomacy. Forbidding them is irrational. It is way cheaper to conquer territory through marriage than through an army. But the statutes themselves are an interesting statement of intention, one that was never implemented, right? The primary author of the statutes is Lionel, the Duke of Clarence, and he left Ireland the next year. They do show the influence of these earlier writings. Why ban cultural assimilation, intermarriage, fosterage, right? Unless, well, you're taking seriously the warnings of those werewolves. This people shall chance from living among us to adopt our depraved habits. Irish sources from this period are understandably very different, by the way. The Annals of Tigernach refer to 1170 as the beginning of Erin's evil. They describe the plundering and destroying of churches. Lots of the annals talk about the destruction of religious houses. There's no mention of the Loudonville or any religious or doctrinal justifications. Dermot McMurcurta is broadly blamed for the invasion and the subsequent destruction. The 14th century bardic history, the Triumphs of Turlough, written to praise the O'Brien clan, lays the blame on Irish lords who allied with the invaders, and particularly praises Conor O'Brien for not doing that, basically. The Topographia's influence is mostly seen in English writings. It shapes the themes of early modern writers. For example, Edmund Spenser's view of the present state of Ireland was written about 1596, although not published for a few years after that. But at this point, the issue of religion in Ireland has added the complication of the Protestant Reformation, which, as you likely know, successful in England, less so in Ireland, right? Now, Spenser had lived in Ireland for years in the service of Arthur Grey, the Lord Deputy of Ireland for Queen Elizabeth. And he also owned estates in County Cork. So the context for his writings was the Desmond rebellions. The Earls of Desmond, or the Fitzgerald family, descendants of the Norman Geraldine family, rebelled against the expansion of English rule in the 1570s and then again in the 1580s. Spenser says of the old English families in Ireland, saying, "The most part of them are degenerated and grown almost mere Irish, and more malicious to the English than the very Irish themselves." Religion, of course, is also an issue for Spenser. As it was in the Desmond rebellions, the Fitzgeralds are a Catholic family, and the rebellion is not purely religious, but certainly religion is one of the factors there, right? Spenser's issues with Irish religion are incredibly similar to Gerald of Wales's. He feels the Irish to be ignorant of true faith. This is what he says: "Therefore, the fault which I find in religion is but one, but the same universal throughout all the country. That is, that they are all papists by their profession, but in the same, so blindly and brutishly informed for the most part, as that you would rather think them atheists or infidels, for not one amongst 100 knoweth any ground of religion and any article of his faith, but can perhaps say his Paternoster or his Ave Maria without any knowledge or understanding what one word thereof meaneth. So to Spencer, the problem isn't that the Irish aren't Protestant. He thinks they're also not even really Catholic. Spencer, like most early modern English writers, had read Gerald of Wales and was profoundly influenced by him. We can also see Gerald's influence in the writings of Edmund Campion's a 1571 History of Ireland, and Richard Stanihurst's writings on Ireland that appear in Holinshed's Chronicles in 1577. None of those books were quite as extreme as Spencer, who famously called for some very intense scorched earth tactics to be used against Irish rebels. But they repeat a lot of the same ideas. Campion wrote of the Old English, the very English of birth, conversant with the brutish sort of that people, become degenerate in short space, and are quite altered into the worst rank of Irish rogue. For 16th century writers, the context is the Tudor reconquest of Ireland. The attempt by Henry VIII and his successors to establish or re-establish English government and legal control. Oh, good, thanks. This period also includes some great visual imagery, which comes from this separate book, John Derrick's Image of Ireland from 1581. And you've likely seen some of these images, right? So for instance, famously, this is the title page, but the famous image you likely would have seen, if you go to the next slide, is this one of an Irish lord feasting in the woods, right? Or this next one, of a defeated woodkern. So an Irish rebel soldier left alone in the woods, following his inevitable defeat, surrounded ominously by wolves. And these wolves also talk, although I don't think they're meant to talk like the werewolves of Gerald's story. These early modern accounts are less fantastical, but the main idea is really the same. Beautiful country, barbarous people. The 17th century Irish writer Geoffrey Keating hated descriptions like this. In his own 1634 Forish Feshe Erin, yes, written in Irish, this is a page from a translation from an original manuscript of it. He calls Gerald ignorant and malicious, the great patron of these mercenary and sordid historians, by which he does mean Spencer and Campion and all of them, right? Of the other writers, he accuses them of willful distortion, saying, in their accounts of this kingdom, these authors dwell upon manners of the lower and baser sort of people, relate idle and fabulous stories invented on purpose to amuse the vulgar and ignorant, and pass over all that might be said with justice to the honor and nobility of the gentry of the nation. Yeah. So Keating, you might note from that line, has some of his own prejudices against the lower classes. He's angry that English writers ignore the accomplishments of the Irish upper classes, a group whom he thinks deserve more credit for their charity, their piety, their learning, and their courage, and a group that Keating does belong to, right? Keating's ancestry was both Irish and Norman. He was also a Catholic priest, which is very relevant for his perspective. So he doesn't take issue with the religious motives of the Norman conquest that Gerald describes, but he condemns the Normans for instead of propagating the religion of Christ, having nothing in view but plunder. He argues that there was never much heresy in Ireland, and that it has been exaggerated, right? Keating mostly feels that the invasion of Ireland isn't so much bad as it was mismanaged, and that Ireland was poorly governed in the years that followed. Keating and John Lynch, the coiner of that more Irish than the Irish themselves phrase, which appeared in this book, Conveniences Eversus, are both examples of that very phrase, actually, because they're exactly what the statutes of Kilkenny and those werewolves and everyone else warned about, right? Both are Anglo-Norman of Irish and English descent who identify very strongly with the Irish parts of that descent. Keating wrote his book in the Irish language. Like their English counterparts, their histories of Ireland have as much, if not more, to say about the 17th century context in which they are written than they do about the 12th century events that they are describing. Keating and Lynch are speaking about the immediate context of their era. Lynch dedicated his book, published in 1662, to King Charles II, saying, "Most gracious sovereign, the love of my country has been always implanted so deeply in my breast. I have now devoted myself to vindicate and restore to its ancient splendor the character of my nation." Now, of course, he's writing this in 1662, so a few years after the death of Oliver Cromwell, at which point an English monarch who has spent years living in Catholic France probably seems like a very good friend to make. So obviously for these early modern writers, Spencer, Keating, and Lynch, the Protestant Reformation had created new tensions in the Anglo-Irish relationship. All of these events and all of these sources have been reinterpreted continuously. Early modern writers rewrote the medieval history of Ireland to comment on contemporary events. So Tudor writers write to justify the Tudor reconquest, and 17th century Irish writers are responding in kind to that. One of the goals of this collection was to provide some context for these extra layers of meaning that often inform Anglo-Irish relations. And this book has come at a time of a lot of change in those relations. So I'm not sure what new metaphor politicians are likely to adopt to explain the Anglo-Irish relationship as we move further into the 21st century. I don't really like speculating about the future. It's the opposite of my job. Path to fatality seems very pessimistic. So I'll conclude with how Higgins phrased it in 2014. The shadow of the past has become the shelter of the present. While we grieve for lost lives, we will not let any painful aspect of our shared history deflect us from crafting a future that offers hope and opportunity for the British and Irish people. Thank you.
Okay, so we're just going to see if there's questions. I'm looking at Zoom here. I don't want to kill myself on the stairs. Okay, good. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, no problem.
So that was amazing. You forget, well, not that you forget, but you know how long the relationship is. And I was kind of struck by, I had forgotten the religion thing was even more complicated. You know, it's not just kind of the Reformation.
Yeah, it dates back to like the 7th century or something. Yeah.
So did any of you on Zoom have questions? You can type it into the Q&A feature there and we'll be happy to answer. I think we don't have questions from Zoom yet, but they can ask in there. Meg, did you or anyone in the audience here have questions?
I guess just picking up on something you said earlier about Lloyd George, I think that he's Welsh.
He is.
Oh yeah, the
yes.
wizard.
And I just wondered, did he himself sort of have a complicated relationship with the English? Was there part of him that identified more with the Irish?
So the question was just because David Lloyd George was also Welsh, just because they might not have heard it.
Mhm.
Was his own relationship more complicated? Because he was Welsh, even though he was the British Prime Minister.
Yeah, yeah. So he's a British Prime Minister, and to some extent, yes, I think his views on the relationship are likely shaped by a combination of factors. So one, his political affiliation, right? His political party was the one that, you know, throughout the 19th century had been open to the concept of home rule, right? So there's that, but then you're right. Also, he's coming at this from a Welsh context, so he is more open to the idea of home rule for Ireland. It, you know, he just winds up being prime minister during this time. Yeah. No.
Well, and it, you know, it's such a fascinating. There's been, I can't remember who the guy was. Gee, my own history's gone. 1870 anyway. The Land Act Gladstone.
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So like there was this kind of compromise in the late 19th century, which is the first time we've started to see that. You know, maybe you could argue the famine kind of hastened that because a lot of the landlords are bankrupt. You know, so these land acts have to happen. But it's we were talking the other night when we did our Brexit, you know, panel. England doesn't think about Ireland as much as Ireland thinks about England, and so all these times it's just such a one-way street, you know, which is now more, I think, more obvious to us now, because in the north of Ireland, particularly the Unionists, obviously in a post-Brexit world, you know, they voted to remain as part of Europe, but now it's more important to them to retain the union with England, and England haven't, or Great Britain haven't really thought much about them. So it's interesting to trace that relationship.
Yeah, there's been a really interesting shift within English conservatism where they seem to not value the union of the United Kingdom as much anymore. And that used to be just like the core issue for the Conservative Party. And the reason they're so like not on board with any idea of home rule in the 19th century is just like the union is first and foremost for them. And at times, I think, if I'm remembering from the 19th and early 20th century, like the Liberal Party relied on the Irish Parliamentary Party to make up some of its coalitions. So, and actually, we have seen that recently because for a while, didn't May need? She needed some 9 members of the DUP, right? So they they'll think about Irish political parties when you need it for your coalition government.
Yeah. But it's incredible to think. I mean, we grew up, hearing about Gerald of Wales and the terrible things about bestiality and killing horses and bathing in their blood and all this other stuff.
Which, maybe.
Which I'm sure happened. but it's very...
I don't think there's an oxman, though.
Exactly. I hope there isn't. Or a woman with a goat,
Yeah, I mean, who knows?
The interesting thing is, I had not realized that in those early days, the criticism was that they were not Catholic enough. You always tend to think of the Irish, we were the island of saints and scholars and we were out proselytizing to the world. And yet, it's very interesting that our dynamic of the church was not based around cities. And so it's a very different kind of church. And,
yeah, that early medieval seems to evolve very differently. Yeah. And then, of course, later the Catholic Church's view post the Reformation, they're on board with anyone who's happy to continue to be Catholic. So it shifts a bit. But yeah, for centuries, the Catholic Church gets annoyed with Ireland for, being modeled differently. And then also, I think, tithes.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. And like St. Patrick was not actually canonized into the church officially. I mean, they didn't really do it in those days, but at the same time, he's not an actual canonized saint.
Right. Yeah.
And so
they just kind of don't argue it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, try taking him off us. but it is interesting to me that, we've always had this idea of Ireland as a super Catholic country. And now we know ourselves, that because of the statutes of Kilkenny and then later the penal laws, actually there was very little catechism going on in the country. And so, there was not that much of a Catholic education until the devotional revolution of the late 19th century, which then exacerbates the relationship again with England. So religion is a funny thing here, it's a... Yeah,
I mean, even for Spencer, I think he's talking about like their Irish Catholicism as being a sense of identity, but he's really critical because he thinks they don't really understand what they say they believe, right? When he describes that, their ignorance of true faith. That they're only blindly repeating prayers, but don't really believe. But he, of course, educated Englishman, he knows.
Yeah. Well, and that seems to be a kind of a central struggle with Catholics and Protestants anyway, that Catholicism is seen as so kind of superstitious, and there's all this extra stuff that you don't need if you're a true believer because you're either saved or you're not. So we don't have predestination, in Catholicism. Spencer is a funny fella, he owns thousands of acres down in Cork, and the Geraldines, the castle in my hometown in Listowel was the last one to fall, I think, in that Geraldine.
Oh, is it?
Elizabeth maybe is dead not long after it or right before it. Around 1601 or 2, I think the castle falls. Defended by his staff. I'll be delighted to tell you.
Oh, okay.
So but he was hanged, poor man.
But
I'm sure, we came from him. So no one seems to have any questions. But Karen, this was brilliant. I mean, I'm delighted that you covered that earlier stuff because some of that is just so complicated and we don't even really know it ourselves. We learn a little bit from that Forres Fassa Aaron book. But it's so complicated. And then all those lordships, and the more Irish and the Irish themselves. And people always ask that, like, how is it that the Irish
kingdoms when Viking kingdoms arrive. So, they don't know the future.
No, and as you said, there isn't a nationalism. This is an invented thing, really, for all countries. Italy, same thing,
their loyalty is to the O'Connors or the O'Briens or the,
So thanks, guys, for tuning in. We're live again on Saturday with the Brendan Fahey Beckett movie series. We're showing a documentary called The Eighth, which is about the repeal of the Eighth Amendment in Ireland. Quite controversial, and I will say quite timely for what's going on here in America with the Roe v. Wade stuff. And we're looking forward to that. And then we have a talk next week I'm gonna forget the date, with a doctor from University College Cork on monastic life in medieval Ireland, because we have a chalice on display out here in the museum, which is unknown to us. So tune in, keep an eye on the Facebook page, lots of great stuff coming in May. Our topic for the Irish and series in May will be the Irish and Asia. So we'll be looking at the relationship between Irish and Chinese and Irish and Indian nationalism and all that. Betty says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. You're welcome, Betty. We're delighted to have you. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sonnelitter. We're thrilled.
Oh, and just in response to the question, the book is available. You can find it online through my publisher, Broadview. Broadview Press, Irish English Relations.
Yes, we're going to try and get some into the shop, Jack, too.
Yes.
I just haven't ordered them yet, but we'll get them. But go.
We'll chat about that after.
Yeah, okay, we'll chat about that. So I'll email you, Jack.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Take care, everyone. Good night. Thank you.
No.